Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As usual, we'll just wait a minute or two more for anyone that's just joining. But can somebody tell me in the chat whether you can see me, hear me, and see my screen, please? Brilliant. Thank you very much. All right, we'll just give it a moment. Okay, let's get going. Right, so this webinar is one that's actually been rearranged from later on last year. So apologies if anyone's been waiting for this particular topic. The title is Advanced Grouping in Invent. So I'll go over obviously what advanced grouping is, but it basically is a way to allow you to precisely position fields in your Invent template, in your MegaEdit template, relative to other fields that are within the same group. In a nutshell, we'll obviously go into more detail. So the maximum duration of the webinar, as always, is 1 hour, and the recording will be available after the webinar. My name is Sam. I'm the Academy Manager at Infigo, and joining me today, as is becoming routine and tradition now, is Duncan, who from our support team, who many of you will be familiar with, and Duncan will be manning the chat today. So if you've got any questions, fire them into the chat, and Duncan will either try and answer them now if he can, or we can take them away and answer them later on. If you are new to Livestorm and these webinars, then the chat should be somewhere in your bottom right corner if your screen is the same as mine. Okay, so I've also got some resources for you here. So there is a page on the Academy that I'm going to copy and paste into the chat, which will have the recording once we're finished. And it also has some bits and pieces of information I'm going to be using as well. So let me zoom in a little bit. There's loads of written information. What you'll also find in here is a set of resources. So if you do want to have a look at the final product, which is available, which I'll show you in a moment, or if you want to download any of the resources I use to create the product, say if you want to try it yourself or you want to see exactly how I did it, those things are also available for download as a couple of zip files and an Invent MEX file. So you can get those from that page I've just provided to you. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in this hour, I've titled this a kind of a product build workshop. So I'm going to actually start off with a sort of half-built product already in Invent. A lot of the fundamentals, which I think most of you will already know, has already been done. And there's plenty of other resources if you're brand new to Invent. I'm going to focus really on the advanced grouping functionality here. So let me load up a product that's been made for this particular webinar. What we're going to be using here is a trifold. Well, the example here is a trifold leaflet. We're only going to be working on one side just to keep it simple. And it comes in 3 different panels. Very questionable artwork from both myself and AI, but hopefully it will get the point across with what we're trying to achieve. Right. So what is advanced grouping? The best way to explain this is to actually just show you on this product that we're going to make. So it's a way of really fine-tuning how your fields on your canvas are positioned and how they're sized based on the position of other fields within the group, based on the content of certain fields, and based on the rules that you specify around those things. So if I show you briefly what we're going to be working on today, so we're going to split these, what I'm calling panels, into separate sections, so left, right, and center, and you can see the behavior that the advanced grouping is going to do. So for example, on this left-hand side here, What we want to do with this is fine tune it so that when we add more text or take less text away, we still want the full height of the panel full of content. So as a result, if we've got less text, we might want that image to scale as a result. So it's always nice and full. There's no big empty spaces. So what you'll find is that if I start to put some more text content in, for example, the image will scale accordingly to sort of make up that space. If I take some of this text away, again, that image will scale. And I've also got it set up so that if we actually remove these whole sections, then again, the image will scale to fill that gap. By the way, the sample product we're using here is a fake product for a leaflet on an animal sanctuary, hence the ridiculous imagery and boilerplate AI-generated text. Okay. Next, we'll look at the right-hand side and what behavior that can do. We're also going to have a look at how we can incorporate both vertical and horizontal elements in these rules that we're going to create. And the way I'm going to explain this one is we've got here 2 columns in this particular panel, and we want it to be controlled both ways. So we want the contents of both of those columns to be centralized. So that's that horizontal behavior we're going to be working on. But then we also want it to be vertically controlled. So we want it, as the text in those columns gets longer or gets shorter, the remaining space in that panel that we've specified there adjusts to fit so that we have a nice distribution of all of our fields and all of our content. So if I just take a look at some of those and start modifying that. So for example, if I start making, let's see, some of this left panel here have longer text. You can see that everything is repositioning to keep the entire thing centralized, even though one side is longer than the other. It might not be a perfect example that we'd use on your product, but hopefully it gets across what this is capable of. And we'll also see that as we start to put in more text, the spacing in this case, rather than sticking to the top and the bottom of the panel, in this case, we're actually just distributing the remaining gaps between all of the fields. So as I start to enter more text, the gap between each of those fields becomes less and less until we get to the point where there's no space left and it will start to overspill. And we'll also take a look at this central panel as well. So this is where we're demonstrating the usage of nested groups. So we're talking about advanced groups here, which is a reference to the InDesign functionality of grouping your fields together. But what we can do is actually put groups within groups, as you can in InDesign, and apply separate positional and size conditions and constraints to those individual nested groups. And as a result, you can get quite complex behavior. We saw some of it on the right-hand side there, but we'll also see some of it in the center here. So the behavior here is I've got several different things being controlled. One is the yellow boxes for the contact information I've got here. So if I get rid of those, the other ones will move to keep it nice and centralized and look nice and neat. If I get rid of one of those images, again, the remaining things will centralize to make it look hopefully quite nice and neat. And then I've got a higher level even again, where if I get rid of this disclaimer, for example, that I've got at the bottom, the entire size shifts down and that image will resize as a result. So hopefully this shows you the kind of complexity that we've got available in this functionality. I've just seen the message saying, have we frozen? I don't know if that's the same for everybody. It might just be me chatting away at this point rather than actually doing anything on screen. Okay, Daryl, I think that might be on your end, unfortunately. If you can't get it up and running again, then the recording is available for afterwards. Right, okay. Just let me shift my screen around a little bit just so I've got my my notes that I need, and then we'll get started with making this. Okay. So I'm going to load up InDesign. I've tried my best to increase the scale of all the text, for example, as much as InDesign will allow me to do. If it's still a bit small, or the text on your screen, I do apologize. I don't think at this stage there's much more I can do about it, but hopefully you can see the text in the InDesign window. So the product I'm using, again, I've provided it for you for download if you want to use this later on. I'm starting off with the base product, which is just a very, very basic representation of how this might initially look. And all we've got is various different frames, various different text boxes positioned on our page, ready for us to actually do some work in. I've got a few static images already in there and some empty image frames, which we're going to actually link to our invent files. What I've also got, because we don't want to set this up from scratch today in Invent, is I've predefined a lot of the other things that we need to make the product work. So for example, I think most of you will be familiar with this. I've got some resources in there for different clip arts. I've got a lot of variables which control things such as the text boxes, the visibility of certain fields, the images that we're going to choose. As a result, I've got them all nicely set up on a form. So they all hopefully appear quite nicely to us when we're looking at our products in Mega Edit. And I've set up a couple of very basic logic statements as well, just to make certain fields show and hide when certain checkboxes are clicked. But apart from that, it's brand new. It's from scratch. Okay. Right, so before I get into specifically doing this, I do want to talk about a couple of general setup tips to make your life easier when you're working on this kind of thing. So one thing to consider is naming conventions. So for this, you would probably use the Layers tab, which is within InDesign itself. I've got it set up side by side with Invent here. Make sure, or you don't have to, but it's highly recommended to rename all the fields and all the groups that you end up creating with some relevant name. If you don't name them and then you start trying to play around with them in Invent, you're going to very quickly get confused as to which field it is you're looking at, and it's going to drive you crazy. So make sure that you're renaming as you go along. I would also recommend sorting out the sort of stack order here as well. Again, it's not a necessity, but it will make just a bit clearer as you're going through the process. So what I mean by this is, if you're wanting your the behavior of your fields to behave in this order, so for example, the text area butts up against the header, this separator butts up against the text area. In reality, you only need to order those inside InDesign, inside Invent, which I'll show you later on. But it will make your life and understanding a bit easier if you also do the same thing in the Layers tab, just so it's nice and easy to view and appreciate. Okay. Another thing you'll need to do, which I forgot to do a couple of times during the setup of this, is in order to use these in Invent, you will need to enable all of the fields within InDesign. So again, most of you will be familiar with this with individual fields. If you go to properties in Invent, you change whether that field is static or whether it's enabled in Invent. You will need to do this for all of the fields you want to utilize as part of this advanced grouping, and the groups as well. That's the important point. The groups as well need to be enabled. But we'll do that as we're going through the process. Make sure that you've linked up all your variables, so standard Invent 101. And then it's also a good idea to do iterative testing. So especially if it's early days with this and you've only tried it once or twice or not at all, you can just get ahead of yourself and try and set up the whole thing in one go. But then if you then move it over to MegaEdit and there's a bit of a problem, which in all likelihood, it won't do exactly what you want the first time, because it can get a bit complicated if you've got a complex template. You're going to struggle to isolate exactly where those problems are. So what I would recommend is going sort of an iterative process. Set up one bit, take it over for testing. Set up the next bit, take it over for testing. It takes a little bit longer, but I think overall, it might actually take a bit shorter because you can find the problems faster. Okay. Right, so let's start off with our left panel. So as a reminder, what we want this to do is we want the image here to be the main thing that's filling our remaining space. So we want the content to be bolted to the top of the panel. We want it to be bolted to the bottom of the panel, so there's no empty space around there. But then when we actually need to either provide more space or take away more space, it's the image which is going to give up that, that functionality. Okay. So one concept that we need to look at as well is the concept of a boundary frame. So what I'm going to do, oh, I've lost that button since I've changed my screen around. Interesting. Oh, it's down here. Okay, so I'm going to draw an empty text frame here. And I'm going to call this my boundary frame. And what I'm doing with this is it's an optional step for each of the groups that you're making. And it is really needed if you want to control what the outer boundary is of the group that you're going to make and you're going to control. So if you don't specify a boundary frame, and if I get ahead of myself here, I apologize, I will go through it later. If you don't use a boundary frame and you group some fields together, the boundary of that frame, the boundary of that group will be wherever the frames end. If you want more control over where that boundary is going to be and want to have much more say over exactly how it's positioned, then I'd recommend using one of these boundary frames. Again, it's completely optional whether you do use it. It's very situational whether you would, and it's easy to play around with them both to see if they do what you want them to do. However, that boundary field needs to just be an empty frame, nothing in it, no imagery or anything like that. So this disappeared, but this button here in InDesign will do exactly what you want. Okay, I'm going to rename that. Just call it left panel boundary, for example. And then I'm going to select all of the fields that I want in that particular panel or that particular group, and I'm going to group them all together in InDesign. So I'm just going to select them using the Layers tab. I just find it a little bit easier. Right click and group them together. So what you'll find when you go over to Invent and start trying to meddle with the properties of this, if all of the fields contained within that particular group are not enabled, then you won't actually be able to do anything with it. So this is where you need to make sure that all the fields are enabled and then the group itself is enabled. So let me rename that group. Group. Then I'm going to select all of my things again that are contained within it. This is just a bit of a time saver. If you've got multiple things selected, you can enable them all in one click rather than having to go to them all independently. Or if you multi-select them, you can see their options for all of these in a list as well. It just makes it a bit easier than having to control them all in isolation. Bear in mind that you do need to enable your boundary as well. So if you are using a boundary field, you will need to make sure that's enabled in Invent as well. If I go to my boundary, make that an image, and now I should be able to enable that group. And there we go. Okay, sorry, I'm just checking my notes to make sure I've not missed anything. Right, so one thing that we might have to consider with some of these fields, especially for the text fields, I think, is how they're able to grow. So, for example, if I go to one of these text fields here, so the one which is a text area, which needs to grow or shrink, go to Invent and go to its properties, and you'll see here we've got an option which is the text field size constraint, which is right down at the bottom when you're on the text tab. And this controls how that field size can grow. So if you are wanting it to grow or to shrink, then you need to make sure that it is able to grow in that particular direction. I think by default, they're set to fixed, if I remember correctly, so it won't grow automatically. So you want to set that, in this case, for example, to vertical to allow it to change size. Okay. Right, so to actually set up the advanced grouping, if I go to my left panel group that we made, go to Invent and then go to the Properties tab. And then what we see on here as part of the group settings is where we set up this entire thing. So some of these you will be familiar with from existing functionality. So Group Master, for example, this works with advanced grouping as well. So if you want one particular field to control the behavior of the rest, like if that field is hidden, the rest of the fields will hide, then you can specify a Group Master. We've got the ability to specify whether or not we want uniform font size in the group. So to be honest, we want this turned off in this particular group because there's two different sizes of font we want to maintain for this example. We've got spread behavior, which was existing even prior to these advanced options. So that's just allowing things to move based on the visibility of other things. There's other tutorials on that. That's not the focus of this particular webinar. And then what we're focusing on here is advanced options. So I'm going to say here that we've got the ability to specify in what axes we want this particular group to be varied in. So we've got adjust vertically, which is what we're going to do here. Adjust horizontally, which is what we'll deal with kind of in this central panel here and with the columns over here. And then much lesser used, we've got control vertically and horizontally. Now I'll get into a bit more detail on this later on as to why that's very little used. But what that essentially will do is give you some diagonally stacked fields where you're just controlling the horizontal and the vertical. So you're specifying a position and then specifying a position that way. So you end up with them diagonal. If you want the behavior like we've got in this one or in this one, then we'll use a different approach, which I'll talk about later. So I'm going to say adjust vertically. This is where we get the option to specify our boundary item if we have one. So there it will show me all of the empty image frames that I can select from. I can select my boundary. That means it will disappear from this prevailing list underneath. Now, what this list has, ignoring the align options there for a moment, is all of the different fields that are present within that group. And this is the main place where we want the order to be specified, because this is where things positioned directly above or below each other will directly impact on one another. So this needs to be in the order that you want it to behave in. So let me just check that mine's correct. I've got the header, text, divider, image, divider, and text. So I'm happy with that particular order. Okay, so if I go into the more details on one of these options, so I'll go into my left panel header, for example, go into my advanced settings, and you'll see there that I get options for top, bottom, and height. So what that means is the top margin of that particular frame, the bottom margin of that particular frame, and then the height of the entire frame. And then equally, if I went to adjust horizontally, that would give me left, so the left margin of the frame, the right margin of the frame, and the width of the frame. Okay. Now, we see as well in each of these that we have the option to hide the field if the placeholder is empty. I'm going to turn that off for all of these because I want my visibility to be controlled by other properties. So I'm going to turn those off. Right, now if I go in to try and specify what these top and bottom margins are, you'll see I've got a few different options. So I've got self, and that will maintain the margin of what is currently specified in InDesign. So if I go for self here, for example, you can see that's 8 points. And that is going to be, if I just select both of those fields, that's going to be the difference here between the top of that header text area and the boundary that I've specified. So that's self. If you keep it as self, it means that that gap will always remain at that size, regardless of what else you do. We then have value, which is where you can actually physically specify what that gap is going to be. So you've got various different units that you can choose from, and then you can specify what that particular margin is going to be. And then you've got auto. Now, I'll come on to more examples of this later, but what that allows you to do is to automatically distribute space. So whatever remaining space there is after you've done all your other specifications and however you want it set up, it allows you to automatically distribute the space, either in margins or you can do it in the actual size of the fields themselves. Now, I do have a diagram I want to quickly show you, which goes through this. This is where I struggle to find my correct page. Okay, let's try this. Not the best, but hopefully it's clear enough and you do have access to this page as well. So this is just a very basic explanation of how these different margin methods actually work and how they calculate the space. Because think about it, if you've got, let's say, our header and our text here, so these two, the header has a bottom margin and the text has a top margin. So we need to know how those two actually combine and relate to each other when we're specifying these options so that we get the correct spacing between them. So we'll start off with self. So that uses the distance taken from the InDesign file. So the note I've got here is that even though Invent displays both the left and the right margins, so for example, if you've got, well, let me go through with the example I've got here. So we've got two sample fields, which are side by side. And then in the middle, we've got specified what the right margin of the left field is going to do, what the left margin of the right field is going to do, and then a total gap as it would appear in MegaEdit as a result. That's the basic premise of this simple example. If we just used self, even though in the Invent window, the user interface, it will show self as, in this case, 10 millimeters for both of those margins, it will still only use the total gap that is available in that InDesign file. So even though it will say self 10 for one margin, self 10 for the other margin, the total gap is only 10. So that's all it will use inside MegaEdit. That's probably the most confusing one of the bunch. Then if we look at value, that's a lot easier to understand. So if we specify, for example, 10 millimeters on the right margin, and then another 10 millimeters on the left margin, and they're specified with our value option, then the total gap as it appears in MegaEdit as a result will be 20 millimeters. Okay, and then the next option we have is auto. So as I've mentioned, auto allows a weighting to be applied between the available space to control how that distribution happens. So in addition to automatically getting it to calculate what that space is, we can also specify a weighting of that automatic distribution. And what this basically means is that if you apply a weighting of 1, that will have less space allocated to it than something with a weighting of 2, for example. This allows us to control that spacing. So in my example here, for example, I'm saying for example a lot, I've got weight 1 and weight 1 on both of my margins. The total gap we've got available in MegaEdit is 10 millimeters. So therefore it just distributes 5 millimeters on each of the margins there. Nice and easy. If we've got weighting 2 on one of the fields and weighting 1 on the other, the weighting 2 will have the bigger distribution. And that's proportional. So basically, if we still have that 10 millimeter gap, weighting 2 will get 6.6 millimeters, weighting 1 will get 3.3. And then an important consideration with this is that when you're considering the gap to the boundary, so for example, if we're looking at our thing here, where we've got our header area, its top boundary, its top margin, sorry, is going to be going directly to the boundary. Now, in that point, at that consideration, there's only one margin being considered. There's no opposing margin for it to work against. So that just needs to be considered and factored in when you're setting up your template. So I've got an example here which hopefully shows it. The available gap, not including the fields themselves, is 30 millimeters. And what we want is 10 on one side, 10 in the middle, and 10 on the other side. But as a result, that means that we have to define weight 2 on the outer margins, the ones that hit the boundary, and then weight 1 on the inner margins. And that will mean that we get an equal distribution amongst all of them. Hopefully that makes sense. If you do need some more time staring at this diagram for that to sort of sink in, then this diagram is available on that page I showed you. Yes, it works the same vertically as well. Okay, right. So I apologize if I've run out of time before we do all 3 panels here, by the way. It's taking a bit longer to explain this than I thought. Keep going. So let's replicate that behavior with that information in here. So what we want to do is it's always going to be stuck to the top and the bottom. So what that means, if I go to my group, my left panel header, which is right at the top margin is always going to be 0.0 millimeters, whatever you want it to be, because it's sticking to the top and we don't want it to move. The bottom of that element is going to be a set value as well, and that's going to be 0 because we want that to be snug against the field which appears underneath it in this example. So in this case, we want it to be snug with the text area that appears underneath it. The height of that one I'm going to leave as self because we don't want that one to resize dynamically. And then we'll move on to our first text panel. So again, the top margin of our text is going to be 0 because we want it to be flush against the panel that precedes it. The bottom is going to be 0, but then the height of this one, is going to be controlled by the content that is within the field. So this is an important point. So when we're actually controlling the size of the field, we get an additional option there, which is content based. So the size will change based on whatever is in that field. Okay, we have a divider, which is static. So I'm just going to leave all of those as zero margin and leave the height as self. And then the other interesting one here is the actual image panel itself. So the image frame. So this is the one we need to dynamically resize based on everything else. So the top and bottom margins will be the same as the others. We will get onto some more creative margins later on. And then the actual size of that one, the height size of that particular image is going to be automatic. So that's going to be automatically calculated based on the remaining space. Bear in mind there, we can specify a minimum and a maximum size if it's relevant to your scenario as well. Okay, I'll just do the other two panels quite quickly because they are very similar to ones we've already done. And then my second text will be content. Now, in the interest of saving time, what I was going to do is actually physically export this now, put it into a new MegaEdit product. But in the interest of saving time, we'll just, again, review what that does in the final product, because that is, at this point, all you need to do to actually set that up and get it working on the left panel. So as a reminder of the behavior that gives you, we can control the text that's in these panels, which will always appear, and then the image will rescale depending on what we've specified. Yet the top and the bottom always remain bolted to the outside of that panel, so it's always filling the entire space. Other options we've got here, still using those same options, I've used some logic to say that if I uncheck these areas, then the text box and the divider and the header will disappear. But because we're still using those specified options, as soon as we hide those fields, our image now becomes the top of the list. So whatever the top margin is for that image now becomes against the boundary. And because we specified the margin as 0, it means that that image is now snapping straight to the top. I can do the same with the bottom. And there we get a full-size image. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to very quickly move on to the right panel. If you do have any questions, again, please feel free to put them in the box. Right. So, looking at the right-hand side. Okay, so a very quick reminder of what this one was supposed to do. So we've got two things being controlled here, and I'm actually going to show you a little tip for this. It really helps when you're actually trying to troubleshoot any problems as you're trying to make these. If you hold Control, Shift, and D, and apologies if it doesn't work for you, but I don't think this is admin only. I think this will work for you guys as well as you're working on this. That will just show up all of the outlines of the frames. It's a debugging mode, just so you can actually see what's going on. So what you can see we've got here is we've got a boundary for the columns here. The columns are positioned sort of centrally, horizontally. And what we get is both horizontal and vertical behavior. So as I start to put in some text that widens that text field, it will make sure that both columns are centered overall, even if they're not equal in width. I'll put some more random text in there. You can see that things are rescaling as such. And then the same will occur if I go for the other one. And then also if I start to put in more lines, it's doing a similar behavior to the left panel, but instead of pinning the content to the top and the bottom, it's now just distributing the space that we have available. So this is a greater use of the automatic distribution. Rather than just using one image as automatic, we're now using a lot of the margins as automatic. So all that space is getting distributed and everything stays nice and even on the page. Now, one thing I do need to mention before I forget, if you do end up trying this yourself, this dynamic resizing of nested groups that I'm going to show you. So what we've basically got here is a subgroup which contains the columns, and that's within a larger group, which is the entire panel. If you try this within the next few days, you'll find that you can't resize the subgroup based on the content of the subgroup. It's just a small bug that was found in the functionality. It's been repaired and it's going to be deployed quite soon. I'm using a pre-release version of the InDesign script, the invent script, which is repairing that behavior. So if you do try and recreate it and it's not quite working as expected, that's probably why. Right. Okay. So I'm just checking my notes. So what I'm going to do is launch our InDesign file. And I don't want to use a boundary for this one. So I'm happy with the fact that the two columns for the subgroups are going to be controlling what the actual boundary is, because we can make it so that it scales and it maybe doesn't need to be anything other than the boundary created by the grouped fields themselves. Again, it's very situational when you would use that boundary field. So what I'm going to do is just select the columns, if I can find them. So there's two of my columns. I'll group those together. So I'll put that right upper column. And then my lower ones. Lower column. Right. So again, another little tip for you. If you are having to do sort of nested groups, then you probably want to work from the lowest level group upwards rather than the other way around. You just make it a lot easier for you. So start from the lowest level group in the tree, which in this case is my columns, and then work upwards. So specify everything here, then I'd take it over and test it to make sure it works. And then once you're happy with that, then put it in a larger group and specify the behavior of the larger group. Okay, right. So I'm going to enable both of those groups. And then I'm going to set the behavior here to be adjust horizontally for both of those groups, because this one, we're not looking at vertically at the moment. We're splitting out the horizontal and the vertical behavior completely here into these two separate groups. So these two groups we've made at this point in time, are both horizontal behavior. And they have no boundary item specified, so we can just leave that. Okay, make sure that you're happy with your stack order of your fields. So the same way it worked top to bottom before, you're kind of working left to right here. So you're looking at the left and right margin of the left column first and then the right column second for me, which is exactly what I want, which is all good. Right, so the behavior we've got here is that we want to maintain a central gap that doesn't change, and it's the outside space that's going to be modified to try and keep it central. So what we've got, and I've not pointed out so far, is some pre-configuration options. All these options do is some pre-created scenarios where it will automatically set some of the options that are within these advanced settings. So for example, if I say align left, you can see that automatically adjusts those settings to be what it considers to be align left. Chances are that when you select one of these, it won't do exactly what you want first time. So my recommendation is to click the one that you think is closest, but then still go through and fine tune exactly what this is you're going to want this to do. So what I'm going to do is specify one of our examples here. I'm going to go with space around is probably quite a close one. So that will mean that we always have automatically calculated space around the edge of all the fields. That automatically changes everything to auto, but that's not exactly what I want. So I'm going to change that a little bit. So starting off with my inner boundary here, that I want that to be a fixed value that doesn't change. It's a total value I want of 4 millimeters distance. So I'm going to specify 2 millimeters on each of those relevant margins. So the right margin on my left box and the left margin on my right box. There's a lot of left and right goes on in this. Okay, and then our outer margins need to be that automatically calculated amount. And then you just need to be an equal weighting. It doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, or whatever in this case. As long as they're equal, it means they will get an equal distribution of that remaining space that we have available. So just to keep it nice and simple, I'm going to go for a weighting of 1 on each of those. And maybe I don't want it to go too close to the edge. So maybe I'll put in a minimum value there as well. Just so if it can avoid it, it doesn't go too close to the edge. Okay, now again, in the interest of time, I won't replicate that on the bottom, but that is exactly the same functionality. And then what I'm going to do is multi-select. Well, I'm going to create our upper level group now, our higher level group. So I'm going to multi-select all the fields that we have in the right panel here. Rather than selecting the individual columns, I'm going to select the group. And it's the group that's going to appear within our Invent tab here. So if I say, for example, so we've got our header, we've got our upper column group. I'm not going to select the individual fields within the group. Divider, subheader, right to lower group, and that should be everything in there. I'm going to put that into a group, make sure that group's renamed and enabled. Add a boundary if you feel you need it. I'm not going to do it in the interest of time. And then enable. And what you'll see is that instead of all the individual fields, we actually get the group as part of this. So within there, I've got right upper column and right lower column. They've appeared as entries in my stack. This is vertical behavior that we're controlling, so I can say adjust vertically. If I have one, I can specify a boundary, and then again, I can start modifying these fields. And when we're looking at the entire group, it's exactly the same set of options that you have with individual fields. So even if you're modifying a subgroup like we have here, you're still saying, well, what's the top margin of the group? What's the bottom margin of the group? What's the height of the group? All left, right, and width. So in this case, we want a nice weighting all around that particular product. So everything is nicely spaced. So I might go for just one of the pre-existing options there, which is space around. And what that will give us is all of the interior margins will have a weighting of 1. The exterior margins will have a weighting of 2. And that will mean all of the spacing is the same between all of the different gaps. Okay, that's it for that particular panel as well. So as a very quick reminder of what that does, I'll put on our debugging mode again. There's space all around these different fields. If I modify that text, it will distribute that space, and our horizontal behavior is being controlled individually by those subgroups. Right. So very quickly, let's have a look at our central panel. Now, this isn't much that's new, to be honest. We've covered most of it in the left and right. This has just got multiple nested groups. And this is where that recommendation of going from the bottom level group up really comes into play, because it just makes it much, much easier. And what I also want to very quickly show you here is why it's important to really consider what your margins are going to be. Because it can get you into trouble if you don't really think about how they're going to operate. So what I'm going to start with here is our lowest level group on the central panel, which is going to be these 3 contact details areas. So I'm going to select all of those, put those into a group. Enable that group. And let's start setting some behavior. So this is what we want this to do, is centralize based on which ones are showing and hiding. So if there's all 3 showing, it's this behavior here. If there's 2 showing, so one's hidden, it will redistribute them so they're sort of centralized vertically. And then if there's only 1 showing, it will just show the central, it'll show it in the middle, regardless of which one of those details it is. So it repositions based on how many there are. But we do need to be careful about how we specify the margins. Because, for example, if we hide this top field, let me try and get a more practical example here. So we might say, adjust vertically. Let's say our top margin is 0 because it's flush against what the boundary is. Our bottom margin might be self, so it maintains what that distance is. And then all of our interior margins might remain as self in theory, because we think, oh, well, it's all nicely positioned in InDesign, so I'm just going to leave it with what it is. We might even put the top one as self. However, if you then hide this top field for whatever reason, so let's say it's empty, and then you say, okay, well, it's going to re-centralize, then it's field number 2 that's then going to have the top boundary margin. So whatever you've specified as your top boundary behavior for field number 2 is now going to be prevalent at the top of the field. So for example, if you'd specified a value of 0 here, when all 3 are present, it's going to be bolted to the top of your boundary. But if you then hide the first field, then the second field isn't automatically going to bolt to the top of the boundary because it's using self as its margin. So hopefully that kind of illustrates why you need to really pay attention to how you're configuring these things. It might be a little bit of trial and error while you're getting used to it. But just remember that you can set different values for the top and the bottom margin if you're making things disappear. You can make it so things have got equal spacing around and all that kind of stuff. What we're going to do in this one is nice and simple. We're just going to say space around vertically, same as we did here, so that everything is nice and centralized. Okay, I'm then going to go for my next group up. So that group we've just made is doing vertical behavior. Our next group up is going to be doing horizontal behavior. So we've got 2 image frames and this group here. And what we want this to do is quite similar. So if we hide either of the image frames or everything within that central group, then we want the remaining fields to all be squashed and centralized into the middle. So we've not got some offset either side. So if I go to, I apologize if a lot of this is repetition. I'm just trying to really drill the points home here. Let's see. So where is it? Central panel. Left image, contact details group, and right image. Select all three of those. We don't need to individually select the fields inside that subgroup. And then I'll do this really quickly. Remember, in this case, it's going to be adjust horizontally rather than vertically. We've not bothered with a boundary again, so we can leave that as none because it's not required as such. And then again, in my case, I might want to go space around just to make sure that there's an equal distribution of spacing. But we can modify those settings to be more applicable to our own scenario if we want to do so. So that's two nested groups. Now we've got one more group, which is again looking at vertical behavior. So this is the entire contents of that central panel. So I'm going to select the main image, a boundary if we had one, but I've not specified one here. So the main image, the group that we just made, and that bottom disclaimer as well. I'm going to group those together, rename it. It's going to be vertical behavior, boundary item if we have one, and then this behavior is going to be slightly different, just as a final one here. So we want it that it's bolted to the top, but then if we move things down, or sorry, if we get rid of these fields, then the image will change size to sort of fill that remaining space. So again, make sure that our stack is in the correct order, which I'm happy with. My top value is going to be 0. My bottom value is going to be self, so it maintains this spacing between the contact group and the image. But then my height is going to be auto. So it's auto calculate the height. Okay, we'll say the margins for the group here are self, self, and we'll just leave it as self so it doesn't change. And then our disclaimer, we'll set the bottom to auto, I think, so that it will not try and pin stuff to the bottom all the time. Let me just double check if that's what I did in my other one. And I've got it pinned to the bottom in there. Pin to the bottom. My top as self, and then my height as self. So that's more or less the distribution of settings I want there. It might need a bit of fine tuning because I'm rushing a little bit based on time. But what that behavior will do in our final one here. So obviously we've got some rules and variables associated around this, allowing me to show and hide these different fields. But what we should see is some quite neat behavior where based on what fields we've got filled, it will show or hide. And then based on the rules that we've specified, it will reposition everything to accommodate those rules that we've set. So for example, if I put a second image in here, not that one, where's my other image? Let's see. Now, a bad example, I don't think I've selected the right image there, but you see the behavior. So for example, if I get rid of this second image, it re-centralizes those fields because it's keeping all of the horizontal group centralized. And then if we start to hide some of these options, it expands that image to suit. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to show you today. Apologies if anyone's having to jump because I've hit the time limit. I'm only going to be a couple of minutes from now. Just to show you the things that are available in the resources if you want to try and replicate this or take a look. So all of those things I've used can be downloaded, and you can see the final product on a test storefront. I've got a couple of GIFs which are showing the expected behavior of the product. There's a step-by-step guide of what I've set in that particular product if you want a reference. There's a few tips and tricks which might be quite useful, which I've hopefully mentioned most of them as we've gone through the content today. And then that margin explanation diagram, in case you need it for reference, is in that material as well. And then once I've processed the video, once we've finished this, I'll upload it here so that everything's all in the same place. Okay, so I think that's about it. If you've stayed with me for this long, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I hope you found it useful, and I hope it's been new content for you as well. So yeah, so based on this, I look forward to seeing some even more amazing Invent templates. So go and create. Let us know if you make anything good that you want us to showcase. And I'll speak to you next time, which will be the webinar in about a month or 6 weeks' time. So thank you very much. I'll speak to you soon.